In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where mighty empires span thousands of worlds and ancient species wield powers beyond imagination, there exists a simple truth that even the most powerful beings have forgotten: sometimes the greatest strength comes not from conquest, but from compassion. When Captain Sarah Chen of the human exploration vessel Wanderer first encountered the creature begging for scraps outside the Galactic Trade Station's food courts, she had no idea that this moment would reshape the balance of power across 3 star systems. The being before her, 12 feet tall, covered in obsidian scales that shimmer with an inner fire, with eyes like molten gold, was unmistakably a Drachmaran, one of the most feared predator species in known space. Yet here it was, reduced to asking for leftovers. What Sarah couldn't know was that this wasn't just any Drachmaran. This was Vorthak the Flamespeaker, once heir to the dragon throne of Pyraxis, now exiled and stripped of everything except his pride, and even that was wearing thin after months of hunger. What neither of them could predict was that their chance encounter would awaken something that had been dormant in both their species for millennia. Sometimes the universe's greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. Sometimes a simple act of kindness between strangers can ignite a fire that burns across the stars. And sometimes, when 2 very different beings look into each other's eyes, they discover that they're not so different after all. This is the story of how humanity's greatest weakness became their ultimate strength, and how a disgraced dragon learned that true nobility isn't about the throne you sit upon, but the choices you make when no one is watching. Captain Sarah Chen pushed her half-finished meal away and rubbed her tired eyes. The Galactic Trade Station's food court buzzed with the constant chatter of 100 different species, their universal translators creating a symphony of overlapping conversations in every language imaginable. The smell of exotic spices and alien cuisines filled the air, but Sarah had lost her appetite hours ago. The supply negotiations weren't going well. The Ulterian merchants wanted triple the usual price for quantum fuel cells, claiming shortages due to the ongoing conflict in the Outer Rim. Sarah knew it was exploitation, but the human colony ships needed those fuel cells to complete their journey to the Kepler system. Without them, 12,000 human families would be stranded in deep space for months. She stood to leave, gathering her datapad and the remainder of her Terran-style sandwich, when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. In the shadowy alcove between 2 food stalls, something large was moving with careful, deliberate motions. Sarah's military training kicked in immediately. Her hand moved instinctively toward the plasma pistol at her hip, but she stopped when she got a clearer look at what she was seeing. It was a Drachmaran, but not like any she had encountered in her 15 years of service. This one was thin, its obsidian scales dull and lifeless where they should have gleamed with inner fire. The creature's massive frame, easily 12 feet tall even while crouched, seemed to fold in on itself as it carefully picked through a waste disposal unit. Drachmarans were apex predators, the dragon-like rulers of the Pyraxis Empire. They commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the galaxy. Sarah had seen them at diplomatic functions, their scales blazing with bioluminescent displays of power and status, their voices carrying the authority of a species that had never known defeat. This one looked like a shadow of those mighty beings. The creature must have sensed her stare because it looked up suddenly, golden eyes meeting hers across the busy food court. For a moment, neither moved. Sarah saw something in those eyes that she didn't expect, not the predatory hunger she had been trained to fear, but shame. Deep, burning shame. The Drachmaran straightened slowly, its massive claws empty except for what looked like the remnants of someone's discarded meal. It stood there for a long moment, as if debating whether to flee or fight. Instead, it did something that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. It approached her with careful, measured steps, head bowed low in a gesture of submission that seemed to cause it physical pain. When it spoke, its voice was a deep rumble that resonated in Sarah's chest, but the words were soft, almost pleading. "Sir," the creature said, and Sarah realized with surprise that it was addressing her formally despite her obvious lower rank in galactic hierarchies. "May I have the leftovers?" The question hung in the air between them like a charged particle waiting to spark. Around them, the food court had grown noticeably quieter. Other species were beginning to take notice of the strange interaction. A human and a Drachmaran engaging in civil discourse was unusual enough, but a Drachmaran begging was unheard of. Sarah looked down at the half-sandwich in her hand, then back up at the creature's golden eyes. Up close, she could see the subtle signs of malnutrition in the way its scales lay flat against its hide, the slight tremor in its massive hands, the careful way it held itself to conserve energy. Of course, she heard herself say, extending the sandwich toward the creature. Please, take it. The Drachmarin's eyes widened in surprise, as if it had expected rejection or mockery. Its clawed hand reached out slowly, carefully taking the food without touching Sarah's fingers. The gesture was so gentle, so deliberately respectful, that Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Thank you, the creature rumbled, its voice thick with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. Your kindness will not be forgotten. As the Drachmarin brought the sandwich to its mouth, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Around the creature's throat, partially hidden by the fold of skin where its neck met its massive chest, was a scar. Not just any scar, but a pattern of raised tissue that formed symbols. Even without her universal translator, Sarah recognized them as Drachmarin royal marks, the kind that were burned into the flesh of those cast out from their society. This wasn't just any Drachmarin. This was royalty, or had been once. The creature noticed her stare and, its hand moved instinctively to cover the scar. I am called Vorthak, it said simply, as if offering its name in payment for the food. Sarah, she replied, then, found herself adding, Captain Sarah Chen, but, just Sarah is fine. Something flickered in Vorthak's golden eyes, surprise again, but, also something else. Recognition, perhaps. Chen, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. You are human. I have heard stories of your species. Good ones, I hope, Sarah said, attempting lightness despite the gravity of the moment. Vorthak's expression was unreadable. Your people are said to be unusual. Weak in body but possessing something my kind calls the fire that burns without consumption. I never understood what that meant until now. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted near the station's main entrance. Security forces were moving through the crowd, their energy weapons visible and ready. At their head walked a figure that made Sarah's blood run cold, a Drachmarin in full ceremonial armor, its scales blazing with bioluminescent patterns that marked it as high nobility. Vorthak saw them too and took a step backward, his entire body tensing like a coiled spring. I must go, he said urgently. Wait, Sarah called, but she wasn't sure why. Something about this encounter felt unfinished, important in a way she couldn't explain. Vorthak paused and looked back at her. For a moment, their eyes met again, and Sarah felt that strange spark she had experienced when they first looked at each other. It was as if something was being exchanged between them, some understanding that bypassed language and species barriers. Find me in the lower levels if you need anything, Sarah found herself saying. Bay 94. The Ship Wanderer. Vorthak's eyes widened in surprise once more, but he nodded curtly before disappearing into the crowd with surprising grace for such a large creature. Sarah watched him go, then noticed that the security forces had changed direction, moving away from where Vorthak had vanished. As she made her way back to her ship, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just set something in motion, something that would ripple outward in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The rational part of her mind told her to forget the encounter, to focus on her mission and the fuel cells her people desperately needed. But another part, the part that had always gotten her into trouble, whispered that some things were more important than mission parameters. Hours later, as she sat in her quarters aboard the Wanderer, Sarah found herself researching Drachmarin exile customs on her personal datapad. What she learned made her stomach churn. Exiled Drachmarans were stripped of everything, their names, their property, their right to return home. They were marked with the symbols of shame and cast out to survive on their own or die. Most chose to die rather than endure the humiliation. But Vorthak was still alive, still trying to survive. That suggested either incredible strength of will or something else driving him to continue living despite the shame. Sarah wondered which it was, and found herself hoping she would get the chance to find out. She had no way of knowing that 3 levels below, Vorthak was sitting in the darkened cargo bay where he had been hiding for weeks, carefully consuming the sandwich she had given him and thinking about the strange human captain who had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. Like Sarah, he sensed that something had changed when their eyes met, something that went beyond the simple exchange of food for gratitude. In the vast complexity of galactic politics and interspecies relations, such moments were rare. 2 beings from different worlds, different evolutionary paths, different ways of understanding the universe, had connected on some fundamental level. Neither understood what it meant yet, but both felt its importance. The universe, it seemed, was about to become a more interesting place. 3 days passed before Sarah saw Vorthak again, but, when she did, the circumstances were far from pleasant. She was returning from another frustrating negotiation session with the Alterian fuel merchants when she heard the sounds of a commotion coming from one of the station's maintenance sectors. Shouts, the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging, and, underneath it all, a low rumbling that she now recognized as Drachmarin vocalizations under stress. Sarah followed the sounds through a maze of service corridors until she reached a large maintenance bay. Through the partially open door, she could see Vorthak backed against a wall, surrounded by 6 security guards of various species. Their weapons were drawn but not yet fired, suggesting this hadn't escalated to lethal force yet. The lead guard, a Korgan with the muscular build and aggressive posture typical of his species, was speaking in harsh, clipped tones. You were seen near the restricted storage areas again, Exile. Station regulations clearly state that your kind are not permitted in sensitive areas. Vorthak's voice remained calm despite his obvious disadvantage. I was seeking shelter from the environmental systems maintenance crew. The lower levels were being vented. I meant no harm. Intent is irrelevant, the Korgan snapped. Your presence alone is a security risk. The Pyraxis Empire has made it clear that any aid or comfort given to their exiles is considered an act of hostility. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. She had dealt with enough bureaucratic bullying in her military career to recognize it when she saw it. The guards weren't enforcing legitimate security concerns, they were exercising petty power over someone who couldn't fight back. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah stepped through the door and into the maintenance bay. Is there a problem here, officers? The guards turned toward her, surprise evident on their faces. The Korgan's expression shifted from annoyance to calculation as he recognized her uniform. Captain Chen, this is station security business. Nothing that concerns human vessels. I'm making it my concern, Sarah replied evenly. This being hasn't committed any crime that I can see. He was seeking shelter from a maintenance operation, which is perfectly reasonable. The Korgan's eyes narrowed. You're defending an exile, Captain. Are you certain you want to associate yourself with this creature's problems? Sarah felt that strange spark again as she glanced at Vorthak. His golden eyes held a mixture of gratitude and concern, as if he was worried that her intervention would bring trouble down on her head. That concern, more than any political consideration, made up her mind. I'm defending someone who was asking for basic consideration, she said firmly. If that's a problem, I suggest you take it up with my government's diplomatic corps. The threat was largely empty. Sarah's government had no real power on this neutral station, but it carried enough weight to give the guards pause. Humans were still relatively new to galactic politics, but they had earned a reputation for being unpredictably stubborn when their principles were challenged. After a long moment, the Korgan holstered his weapon. Very well, Captain. But be aware that your protection only extends as long as you remain on this station. And the Empire has a long memory for those who interfere with their justice. The guards filed out, leaving Sarah alone with Vorthak in the maintenance bay. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then, Vorthak slowly straightened from his defensive crouch, his massive frame unfolding to its full impressive height. That was unwise, he said softly. You have made enemies today for the sake of someone who can offer you nothing in return. Maybe, Sarah admitted. But I couldn't stand there and watch them bully someone who was just trying to find a safe place to rest. Vorthak studied her face with those piercing golden eyes. You truly do not understand the implications of what you have done, do you? Probably not, Sarah said with a rueful smile. I have a habit of acting first and considering consequences later. It's gotten me in trouble before. To her surprise, Vorthak's expression shifted into what might have been amusement. Your species is indeed unusual. Among my people, such impulsive compassion would be considered a fatal weakness. And, among mine, it's often considered our greatest strength, Sarah replied. Though admittedly, there's some debate on that point. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Vorthak spoke again. The guards were not entirely wrong about the restricted areas. I was near the storage sectors, but not for the reasons they assumed. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Oh? Vorthak hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. You mentioned you were having difficulties obtaining quantum fuel cells. I could not help but notice that your negotiations with the Alterian merchants have been unsuccessful. How could you possibly know about my negotiations? Sarah asked, though her tone was more curious than accusatory. The maintenance shafts carry sound well, and I have been living in them for some time. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but isolation makes one sensitive to conversation. Vorthak paused, then continued. The Alterians are lying to you about the shortage. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? There is no shortage of quantum fuel cells. The Alterians have been stockpiling them in the restricted storage areas for months, waiting for the prices to rise. They are artificially creating scarcity to maximize their profits from desperate buyers. The information hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Vorthak was right, then the Alterians were essentially holding her colonists hostage for profit. How do you know this? Because I have seen the storage manifests, Vorthak admitted. When one lives in the shadows, one observes things that others miss. I have watched shipments arrive that were never reported to the trading floor. I have seen inventory logs that do not match the public records. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Even if that's true, I can't prove it. And the Alterians have legal protection under the station's trade regulations. Proof can be obtained, Vorthak said quietly. But it would require someone to access the restricted storage areas and copy the actual inventory records. Which is exactly what those guards just accused you of planning, Sarah realized. Vorthak nodded gravely. Yes. And if I were caught, the consequences would be severe. But, for someone with legitimate business in those areas, someone with the proper clearances and authorizations. Someone like a starship captain conducting a routine inspection, Sarah finished, understanding dawning. The thought had occurred to me, Vorthak admitted. But, I would not ask you to take such a risk for the sake of strangers. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. You're worried about asking me to help 12,000 human colonists because you think they're strangers to me? Vorthak tilted his massive head, confusion evident in his expression. Those colonists are my people, Sarah explained. Some of them are families of crew members serving with me right now. Others are refugees from the resource wars on Earth. They've already sacrificed everything for a chance at a new life, and now they're trapped in space while merchants play games with their survival. Understanding bloomed in Vorthak's golden eyes. You would risk your career and your freedom for them. In a heartbeat, Sarah said without hesitation. The question is, would you risk your life to help me do it? Vorthak was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could almost see him weighing options in his mind. Finally, he spoke. My life has little value as it stands. If I can use it to repay the kindness you have shown me, perhaps it will have meaning again. This isn't about repaying kindness, Sarah said firmly. This is about doing what's right. If you help me expose the Alterian fraud, you'll be saving those colonist families just as much as I will. And why would that matter to me? Vorthak asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Because despite everything that's happened to you, you're still someone who cares about justice. Otherwise, you would have told me about the fuel cells and left me to figure out what to do with the information on my own. Vorthak's expression was unreadable, but Sarah thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. You see more than most, Captain Chen. Just Sarah, she reminded him. And I see someone who's been knocked down but isn't giving up. That's not something I encounter every day, regardless of species. For the first time since she had met him, Vorthak's posture seemed to straighten with something that might have been pride. Not the arrogant pride of nobility, but the quiet pride of someone who had been reminded of their own worth. Very well, Sarah, he said, and her name sounded different when he spoke it, weighted with new meaning. If you are willing to trust an exile with something this important, then I will help you expose the Alterian deception. As they began to plan their approach to the restricted storage areas, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken in recent days. A week ago, she had been a simple transport captain focused on routine supply runs. Now she was planning what amounted to industrial espionage with a disgraced alien prince, all because she couldn't stand to watch suffering when she had the power to help. Her academy instructors would probably have called it a textbook case of mission creep. Sarah preferred to think of it as evolution. The plan they devised was elegant in its simplicity, which Sarah hoped meant it might actually work. As a registered captain conducting business on the station, she had legitimate reasons to request inspections of cargo manifests, especially for goods she was considering purchasing. Vorthak's intimate knowledge of the station's maintenance systems would allow him to guide her to the right storage areas and provide overwatch while she copied the incriminating records. The execution, however, proved to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Sarah's first challenge came when she attempted to request the inspection through official channels. The Altarian trade representative, a tall being with crystalline features and an attitude that suggested he considered humans barely above bacteria on the evolutionary scale, dismissed her request with barely concealed contempt. "Captain Chen," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic overtones typical of his species, "surely you understand that questioning our inventory practices is tantamount to questioning our integrity. Such accusations could damage our carefully cultivated business relationships." "I'm not making accusations," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm simply requesting verification of the quantities you're claiming to have available. It's standard practice in any major procurement operation." The Altarian's crystalline features shifted in what Sarah had learned to recognize as their equivalent of a cold smile. "Standard practice for whom? Your species has been part of galactic commerce for what, 50 of your years? We have been trading across the stars for millennia. I think we understand proper protocols better than you do." The condescension in his tone made Sarah's jaw clench, but she forced herself to remain professional. "Nevertheless, my government requires documentation for any purchase of this magnitude. If you cannot provide verification, I'll have to seek fuel cells elsewhere." "By all means, do so," the Altarian said dismissively. "Though I believe you will find that other suppliers are either unavailable or significantly more expensive. The current shortage affects everyone." Sarah left the meeting with her temper barely under control and a growing certainty that Vorthak was right about the artificial scarcity. The Altarian's confidence suggested he knew she had no alternatives, which was exactly the attitude of someone manipulating a market rather than responding to genuine supply constraints. That evening, she met Vorthak in an abandoned section of the station's lower levels. The area had once been used for atmospheric processing, but newer, more efficient systems had rendered it obsolete. The maze of pipes and conduits provided perfect cover for their planning session. The inspection request was denied, as expected, Sarah reported. "But I managed to get a look at their public filing system while I was in their offices. The discrepancies you mentioned are subtle, but they're there." Vorthak nodded, his golden eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting that provided the only illumination in their makeshift meeting space. "The restricted storage areas are accessed through Maintenance Shaft 7 Alpha. I can guide you there, but the actual data retrieval will have to be your responsibility. My presence near their computers would trigger security protocols." "Understood," Sarah said, checking the small recording device she had borrowed from her ship's emergency kit. "How long do we have once I'm inside?" "The automated systems cycle every 47 minutes during night shift operations. That gives you approximately 35 minutes to locate the files, copy them, and exit before the next security sweep." Sarah felt her pulse quicken with familiar pre-mission adrenaline. "And if something goes wrong?" Vorthak's expression grew grave. "If you were discovered, claim you became lost while inspecting potential storage space for your own cargo. Your captain's credentials should protect you from immediate detention, giving you time to contact your diplomatic corps." "What about you?" "If I am discovered, there will be no diplomatic protection," Vorthak said simply. "Exiles have no legal standing. My capture would likely result in immediate deportation to Pyraxis space, where my former government would handle my fate." The casual way he discussed what amounted to a death sentence made Sarah's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "We don't have to do this. There might be other ways to get the fuel cells. Other ways that would take weeks or months to arrange," Vorthak pointed out. "How long can your colonists remain in space before their life support systems begin to fail?" Sarah had run those calculations herself many times. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if they implement strict rationing. Then, we do not have the luxury of time for other approaches, Vortak concluded. Besides, exposing the Alterian deception will help more than just your colonists. Other species are likely being exploited by the same scheme. It was that comment that sealed Sarah's commitment to the plan. This wasn't just about saving human lives anymore, it was about standing up to the kind of predatory behavior that thrived when good people chose to look the other way. The infiltration began at 0200 station time, when most of the commercial sectors were operating on skeleton crews. Vortak led Sarah through a route that avoided main corridors and security checkpoints, using maintenance passages that seemed impossibly narrow for his massive frame. His knowledge of the station's layout was encyclopedic, and Sarah found herself wondering how many weeks he had spent mapping these passages during his exile. They moved in silence, communicating through hand signals that Vortak had taught her during their planning sessions. Despite the obvious differences in their anatomy, his signals were intuitive enough that Sarah had no trouble understanding his directions. The approach to the restricted storage area required them to traverse a section that was actively monitored by security sensors. Vortak's plan was elegant. He would trigger a minor malfunction in a ventilation system 3 levels away, drawing the attention of the monitoring station while Sarah slipped past their observation post. The distraction worked perfectly. Sarah watched through a gap in the maintenance panels as the security guards responded to alerts about atmospheric irregularities in the residential sector. Once they were gone, Vortak guided her to an access panel that opened directly into the storage area they needed. 35 minutes, he whispered as she prepared to drop down into the storage facility. The terminal you need will be marked with Alterian trade symbols. Look for the inventory management system. Sarah nodded and lowered herself through the access panel, landing silently on the storage area floor. The space was vast, filled with neat rows of shipping containers and automated handling equipment. The silence was broken only by the hum of environmental systems and the distant sound of her own heartbeat. Finding the terminal took longer than she had expected. The Alterian filing system used symbols that her universal translator struggled to interpret accurately, and she spent precious minutes navigating through menus that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. When she finally located the inventory management files, what she found exceeded even her worst expectations. The Alterians weren't just hoarding quantum fuel cells, they were hoarding dozens of critical supplies, from medical equipment to food synthesizer components. The artificial shortages affected everything from luxury goods to life-saving medications. Sarah's hands shook with anger as she copied file after file of evidence. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Entire colonies were being held hostage by artificial scarcity, while the Alterians accumulated wealth from others' desperation. She was so focused on the data that she almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching the storage area. Sarah quickly closed the files and moved toward her exit point, but she could hear voices getting closer. She climbed back up into the maintenance shaft with seconds to spare, pulling the access panel closed just as security guards entered the storage area below. Vortak was waiting for her in the maintenance passage, his expression tense with concern. They moved away from the storage area as quietly as possible, but Sarah could hear the guards conducting a systematic sweep of the facility behind them. They didn't speak until they were back in the abandoned atmospheric processing section, where Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. "Did you get what we needed?" Vortak asked. Sarah held up the recording device, which now contained enough evidence to expose the entire Alterian operation. "More than we needed. This isn't just about fuel cells, Vortak. They're manipulating markets for everything from medicine to food supplies." Vortak's golden eyes blazed with something that might have been righteous anger. "How many lives have been lost while they played their games?" "Too many," Sarah said grimly. "But now we can stop them." As they prepared to leave their meeting place, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted between them during the mission. The careful politeness of their earlier interactions had been replaced by something deeper, trust, perhaps, or the beginning of genuine friendship. They had risked everything together for the sake of strangers, and that shared purpose had created a bond that transcended species barriers. "What happens now?" Vortak asked as they prepared to part ways. "Now I take this evidence to the station authorities and watch the Alterian trade empire come crashing down," Sarah said with satisfaction. And then, I get my people the fuel cells they need at fair market prices. And what of your new enemies? Vorthak asked quietly. The Altarians will not forgive this interference with their plans. Sarah considered this for a moment, then shrugged. Then, I suppose I'll have to be very careful who I trust. Good thing I'm getting better at reading character. Vorthak's expression shifted into what Sarah was learning to recognize as his equivalent of a smile. Indeed. Perhaps exile has taught me something about choosing allies as well. As they went their separate ways, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns her life continued to take. A week ago, her biggest concern had been negotiating fair prices for routine supplies. Now she was carrying evidence that would reshape trade relationships across multiple star systems, and her closest ally was an exiled alien prince who had been reduced to begging for scraps. The universe, she reflected, had a peculiar sense of humor. But sometimes its jokes had surprisingly profound punchlines. The aftermath of exposing the Altarian trade manipulation was swift and brutal. Within hours of Sarah presenting her evidence to the station's Galactic Trade Commission, news of the scandal had spread across 3 star systems. The Altarian Mercantile Collective's stock prices collapsed as trading partners scrambled to distance themselves from the fraud. Emergency supply runs were authorized to colonies that had been unknowingly starved of critical resources, and investigations were launched into similar practices on other trading stations. Sarah should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt hollow as she watched the chaos unfold from her quarters aboard the Wanderer. The evidence she and Vorthak had gathered was irrefutable, and the human colonists would finally get their fuel cells at fair prices. Justice had been served, lives had been saved, and a major corruption had been exposed. So why did she feel like something terrible was about to happen? The answer came 12 hours later, when her communications officer informed her that a Pyraxis Empire battlecruiser had just dropped out of hyperspace and was requesting permission to dock at the station. Sarah's blood ran cold. The Pyraxis Empire didn't send battlecruisers for routine diplomatic missions. She found Vorthak in their usual meeting place in the abandoned atmospheric processing section, but he wasn't alone. Standing with him was another Drachmaran, this one wearing the elaborate ceremonial armor that marked him as high nobility. The newcomer's scales blazed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly, and his presence seemed to make the air itself feel heavier. Sarah, Vorthak said as she approached, his voice carefully neutral. This is Prince Siltharion, third claw of the Dragon Throne and heir to the Pyraxis Empire. The prince's golden eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. Captain Chen. You have involved yourself in matters that concern the Empire. I involved myself in matters that concern justice, Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Standing this close to a Drachmaran in full battle regalia was like standing next to a barely contained explosion. Justice, Prince Siltharion repeated, as if testing the word. An interesting concept. Tell me, Captain, what do you know of the exile you have been consorting with? Sarah glanced at Vorthak, who stood perfectly still with his head bowed in submission. The contrast between him and the prince was stark. Where Siltharion blazed with power and authority, Vorthak seemed to fade into the shadows. I know that he's someone who was willing to risk everything to help save innocent lives, Sarah said carefully. The prince's scales flickered with what might have been amusement. Lives. Yes, Vorthak has always been concerned with lives. It is what led to his downfall. I don't understand, Sarah admitted. Then, allow me to enlighten you, Prince Siltharion said, circling around them with predatory grace. 2 years ago, the Empire was engaged in what your species would call a police action against a rebellious colony world. The inhabitants were harboring terrorists who had attacked Drachmaran civilians. Standard protocol called for orbital bombardment to eliminate the threat quickly and efficiently. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she began to understand where this story was leading. Vorthak was in command of the operation, the prince continued. He was given clear orders to reduce the colony to ash and glass. Instead, he chose to evacuate the civilian population first, giving the terrorists time to escape and ultimately resulting in the deaths of 17 Drachmaran soldiers when the insurgents launched a surprise counterattack. Sarah looked at Vorthak, who still hadn't moved or spoken. She could see the tension in his massive frame, the way his claws were clenched tight enough to draw blood from his own palms. For this act of weakness, Prince Siltharion said with cold satisfaction, Vorthak was stripped of his rank, his titles, and his place in our society. He was marked as an exile and cast out to die in shame. He saved innocent lives, Sarah said, anger building in her chest despite the danger. How is that weakness? Because those lives were not Drachmarin, the prince replied as if explaining something obvious to a child. The strong do not risk themselves for the weak. That is the natural order. Sarah felt something snap inside her, the same righteous fury that had driven her to expose the Altarian conspiracy. The natural order according to who? Your species has built an empire on that philosophy, and where has it gotten you? You're so busy proving you're stronger than everyone else that you've forgotten what strength is actually for. Prince Siltharion's scales blazed brighter, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise several degrees. Careful, human. You speak of things you do not understand. I understand perfectly, Sarah shot back. I understand that you're so threatened by the idea that compassion might be stronger than conquest that you exile anyone who dares to prove it. Vorthak didn't show weakness when he saved those civilians. He showed the kind of courage your empire fears most, the courage to choose what's right over what's easy. The prince's eyes narrowed to golden slits. And what do you think gives you the right to make such judgments about our ways? The same thing that gave me the right to expose the Altarian fraud, Sarah replied. Someone has to stand up for what's right when the people in power won't do it themselves. For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Prince Siltharion's hand moved toward the ornate weapon at his side, and Sarah found herself calculating her chances of reaching her own sidearm before he could draw. Then, unexpectedly, the prince laughed, a sound like controlled thunder that echoed off the walls of their makeshift meeting space. Extraordinary, he said, his voice filled with something that might have been genuine admiration. Vorthak, you have found yourself a most unusual ally. Vorthak finally raised his head, meeting his prince's gaze with visible effort. She is not my ally, your highness. She is my friend. Friend, the prince repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. Another interesting concept. Tell me, Captain Chen, what exactly is your species planning to do with the influence you have gained by exposing the Altarian conspiracy? Sarah blinked in confusion. Influence? Surely you realize what you have accomplished, Prince Siltharion said, his tone becoming almost conversational. You have single-handedly destabilized one of the galaxy's most powerful trade networks. Dozens of governments are now in your debt for revealing the fraud that was bleeding them dry. Your species has gained political capital that could be leveraged for tremendous advantage. The truth was, Sarah hadn't thought about the political implications at all. She had been focused on getting fuel cells for her colonists and exposing injustice. The idea that her actions might have larger consequences hadn't occurred to her. We just wanted to do the right thing, she said honestly. Prince Siltharion's scales flickered with what was definitely amusement now. Just wanted to do the right thing, he repeated. Remarkable. Vorthak, I believe I am beginning to understand what you see in this species. Your Highness? Vorthak asked, confusion evident in his voice. The prince turned to face his exiled kinsman fully. The Dragon Council has been watching the aftermath of your collaboration with Captain Chen. The exposure of the Altarian fraud has saved countless lives across multiple systems, including 3 Drachmarin colony worlds that were facing critical shortages of medical supplies. Vorthak's eyes widened in surprise. I did not know. Of course you did not, Prince Siltharion said, his voice softer now. You never do know the full scope of your compassionate impulses, do you? It is both your greatest weakness and, as I am beginning to realize, perhaps your greatest strength. Sarah felt the conversation shifting in a direction she hadn't expected. What are you saying? I am saying that the Dragon Council has reconsidered Vorthak's exile, the prince replied. Saving Drachmarin lives, even inadvertently, is considered a significant factor in mitigation of past errors in judgment. Vorthak swayed slightly, as if the words had physically struck him. Are you offering me a path back to Pyraxis? I am offering you a choice, Prince Siltharion said carefully. return to the Empire, accept a reduced rank and probationary status, and serve the throne with the understanding that any future acts of unauthorized compassion will result in permanent exile. Or what? Sarah asked when the prince's pause stretched too long. Prince Siltharian's golden eyes fixed on her with renewed intensity. Or accept a new assignment as an imperial observer attached to the human fleet. Study this species that seems to make strength from weakness, and learn whether their approach to compassion might have strategic value for the Empire. The offer hung in the air between them like a live wire. Sarah could see the conflict in Vortak's expression, the desperate longing to return home warring with something else, something that looked like hope for a different kind of future. I would still be in exile, Vortak said quietly. You would still be apart from the Empire, the prince corrected. But you would be serving its interests while doing what you seem compelled to do anyway, protecting the weak and pursuing justice. It might be a way to honor both your nature and your heritage. Vortak looked at Sarah, and she could see the question in his golden eyes. He was asking for her opinion, trusting her judgment in a decision that would shape the rest of his life. The choice has to be yours, Sarah said gently. But I think there might be room for a Drachmarin who wants to use his strength to protect others instead of dominating them. And if you're looking for a place to learn about strength through compassion, well, you could do worse than traveling with humans. Vortak's expression shifted into something that looked almost like peace. Then, I choose the path forward, he said to Prince Siltharian. I choose to learn. The prince nodded gravely. So be it. You will retain your exile marks, but you will serve with honor. Perhaps in time, you will teach us something about this strange human concept of strength through mercy. As Prince Siltharian prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah one final time. Captain Chen, you have set forces in motion that will ripple across the galaxy for years to come. I hope your species is prepared for the responsibilities that come with such influence. We'll figure it out as we go, Sarah replied honestly. We usually do. The prince's laughter echoed off the walls as he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Sarah and Vortak alone with the magnitude of what had just transpired. They had exposed a massive conspiracy, saved countless lives, and somehow managed to bridge the gap between two very different species. Not bad for a simple request for leftovers, Sarah thought. She had a feeling the universe was just getting started with them. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the newly christened exploration vessel Harmony, watching as the last of the human colonist ships disappeared into hyperspace toward their new homes in the Kepler system. The fuel cells they needed had been delivered at cost price, along with generous compensation packages for the delays caused by the Alterian manipulation. More importantly, the exposure of the trade conspiracy had led to sweeping reforms in galactic commerce regulations that would protect other vulnerable populations from similar exploitation. The final transport has achieved stable hyperspace, Vortak reported from his position at the observation station. His massive frame had required some creative modifications to the ship's standard workstations, but the engineering crew had adapted with typically human ingenuity. All 12,000 colonists are en route to their destination. Sarah nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with completing a successful mission. Thank you, Vortak. Please note the time in the official log. It still surprised her sometimes, seeing Vortak in an official capacity aboard a human vessel. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The defeated, desperate creature she had first encountered begging for scraps had evolved into a confident, capable officer who commanded respect from the entire crew. His exile marks remained visible on his throat, but now they seemed to represent survival and growth rather than shame. The crew's acceptance of their Drachmarin observer had been gradual but complete. Initially, there had been wariness and fear. Old prejudices about predator species died hard, and Vortak's imposing physical presence didn't help matters. But his gentle nature and obvious dedication to protecting others had won them over quickly. Now, he was simply part of the family, albeit a 12-foot-tall, fire-breathing member of the family. Captain, came the voice of Communications Officer Torres over the intercom. We're receiving a priority message from Galactic Trade Commission headquarters. They're requesting our assistance with a situation in the Andorian sector. Sarah sighed. Fame, it turned out, was a double-edged sword. The success of their investigation into the Alterian conspiracy had established Sarah and her crew as troubleshooters par excellence. Requests for assistance came in daily from governments, trade organizations, and independent groups facing various crises. Most were legitimate requests for help with genuine problems, but some were attempts to exploit their reputation for political gain.
What's the nature of the situation? Sarah asked. Pirates, Captain.
A new group calling themselves the Crimson Fleet has been raiding supply convoys in the outer systems. They're not just stealing cargo, they're targeting medical supply ships specifically, holding entire colonies hostage until their governments pay ransom.
Sarah felt her jaw tighten.
6 months of dealing with various crises hadn't dulled her anger at those who preyed on the vulnerable.
How many colonies are affected? 7 so far, with more raids reported daily. The local security forces are outgunned and outmaneuvered.
The pirates seem to have inside information about convoy routes and cargo manifests. Sarah looked at Vorthak, who had turned away from his station to listen to the conversation. She could see the same determination in his golden eyes that she felt in her own heart.
Some things never changed. Plot a course for the Andorian sector, she ordered. Maximum speed.
And send a message to the Trade Commission, tell them we're en route and request all available intelligence on these Crimson Fleet pirates. Acknowledged, Captain, Torres replied.
ETA to Andorian space is 14 hours at maximum hyperspace velocity.
As the ship's engines spun up for the jump to hyperspace, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that first encounter in the station's food court. The Harmony was twice the size of her old transport ship, equipped with advanced sensors, defensive systems, and a crew of specialists hand-picked for their skills and dedication to helping others. More importantly, they had developed a reputation that opened doors and commanded attention throughout the galaxy. You know, Vorthak said as he joined her at the observation viewport, there was a time when I would have dismissed the suffering of non-Drachmaran colonies as irrelevant to Imperial interests.
And, now? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Now I understand that suffering is suffering, regardless of species.
The strong have a duty to protect the weak, not exploit them. Vorthak paused, his expression thoughtful. Your people have taught me that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down.
Sarah smiled.
And you've taught us that honor and compassion aren't species-specific traits. Some of the bravest, most noble beings in the galaxy come in unexpected packages. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars shift and blur as the ship entered hyperspace. The familiar sensation of dimensional transition washed over them, that strange feeling of being simultaneously nowhere and everywhere that never quite became routine.
Captain, came Torres's voice again, I'm receiving a personal message for Observer Vorthak. It's from Pyraxis space, marked with Imperial priority codes.
Vorthak's posture stiffened slightly. Communications from the Empire were rare and usually carried significant implications.
Transfer it to my station, please.
Sarah watched as Vorthak reviewed the message, his expression shifting from wariness to surprise to something that looked like cautious hope. When he finished reading, he turned to her with an expression she had never seen before. The Dragon Council has approved my request to establish a formal cultural exchange program between the Empire and the Human Federation, he said, his voice thick with emotion.
They want me to serve as the primary liaison for the new initiative. Vorthak, that's wonderful, Sarah said, genuinely pleased for her friend. It means they're finally recognizing the value of what we've been doing.
More than that, Vorthak replied, his golden eyes bright with excitement.
It means I'm no longer operating as an exile on a probationary assignment.
I'm an official representative of the Empire, tasked with studying and facilitating cooperation with humanity. Sarah felt a smile spreading across her face.
So you're telling me that the disgraced prince I found begging for scraps has become an ambassador?
I'm telling you that the human captain who shared her sandwich with a stranger has helped change the course of interspecies relations for generations to come, Vorthak replied with dignity.
The magnitude of that statement hit Sarah like a physical force.
When she had offered half a sandwich to a hungry creature, she hadn't been thinking about diplomacy or politics or the future of galactic civilization. She had simply seen someone in need and responded with basic human kindness. The fact that this simple gesture had spiraled into something that might reshape how entire civilizations interacted with each other was both humbling and terrifying.
Do you think we're ready for that kind of responsibility? She asked quietly. I think we're ready to try, Vortak replied. And I think the universe needs people who are willing to try, even when the odds seem impossible. As if summoned by their conversation, Torres's voice crackled over the intercom again. Captain, I'm receiving reports from the Andorian sector. The pirates have just hit another convoy, this time carrying emergency medical supplies for a plague outbreak on Andoria Prime. Estimated casualties from delayed treatment could be in the thousands.
Sarah felt the familiar fire ignite in her chest, the same righteous anger that had driven her to expose the Alterian conspiracy and countless other injustices since. The universe was vast and full of suffering, but it was also full of people willing to stand up to those who caused that suffering. Well, observer, she said to Vortak with a grim smile, looks like our new assignment is going to have to wait. We have pirates to stop and lives to save. Vortak's scales flickered with bioluminescent patterns that Sarah had learned to recognize as his equivalent of a predatory grin. With pleasure, Captain. It will be good to remind the galaxy why Drachmarans and humans make such effective partners. As the Harmony hurtled through hyperspace toward another crisis, another opportunity to make a difference, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A simple act of kindness had grown into something that spanned star systems and species barriers. A chance encounter between strangers had become a friendship that was reshaping galactic politics. The universe was vast and often cruel, but it was also full of possibilities. And sometimes, when two very different beings looked into each other's eyes and saw something worth protecting, those possibilities became realities that no one could have predicted. Sarah Chen had started this journey as a transport captain focused on routine supply runs. Now she was leading a crew of species representatives on missions to protect the innocent and expose corruption throughout the galaxy. Vortak had begun as an exile reduced to begging for survival. Now he was an ambassador working to bridge the gap between two civilizations. Neither of them could have imagined such a transformation when they first met in that crowded food court. But then, again, the best changes often came from the most unexpected beginnings. All it took was someone willing to share their leftovers with a stranger, and the courage to see what happened next. The Harmony emerged from hyperspace above a world where pirates were holding innocent lives hostage, and Sarah Chen prepared to once again demonstrate that sometimes the greatest strength came not from the ability to take, but from the willingness to give. Some lessons, it seemed, were worth repeating across the stars.